Good morning. Time now 8 o'clock in the morning in Tokyo, Friday, March 26, 2021. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Group Morning Seminar organized by the World Bank Tokyo office. My name is Koichi Omori. I'm Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize many interesting seminars starting at 8 o'clock in the morning almost every Friday in Japan Standard Time, introducing the latest report presented by the World Bank Group economists and specialists. This morning, it's a pleasure to introduce the latest report titled Women, Business and the Law 2021, published on February 23rd, 1 month ago. In the past, in our seminar programs, we featured the 2019 edition in April 2019 and the 2018 edition in May 2018. We missed the opportunity to introduce the 2020 edition last year, though we were almost there to organize the event, but because of the obvious reasons, we missed the opportunity. But we are pleased to be back in track to continue our tradition to feature the Women, Business and the Law report once it is issued. We have two World Bank specialists joining from Washington. First, Julia Brown-Miller, the private sector development specialist in the Women, Business and the Law project. Julia, good morning and good evening to you. Thanks for joining.
Good morning. It's wonderful to be here. I'm looking forward to discussing with you. Thank you.
Great, perfect. And we have Natalia Mazzoni, analyst in the same Women, Business and Law project. Natalia, how are you?
Hi, Koichi. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us. We're looking forward to the presentation and the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us from Washington. We'll listen to Julia and Natalia presenting the main point of the report in the next 30-40 minutes. As usual, we already received some questions from the viewers in advance, and thank you very much for sending those questions to us. Please keep sending your questions even during the presentation. I'll read your questions asking two speakers to respond after their presentation. With that, I'd like to ask Julia and Natalia to come in, start your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Koichi, and I will share my screen so we can get started. As you mentioned, Women, Business and the Law 2021 was recently released just a month ago on February 23rd, and we're very excited and also very busy presenting the findings. They're very exciting. And in times of crisis, a legal environment that encourages equal economic inclusion can make us less vulnerable. But the reality is that all over the world, many women start at a disadvantage, and discriminatory laws are holding women back from reaching their full potential, threatening not only their economic security, but that of their communities and their countries. And as you know, the World Bank, we believe that no economy can achieve its true potential without equal involvement of both men and women. And that's why at Women, Business and the Law, we identify where exactly laws are preventing women from working and running successful businesses. So over the last 11 years, so yeah, the project has been going on for the past 11 years. So over the last 11 years, we have presented a unique data set that measures the progress towards gender equality in the world of work in 190 economies. So we examine how the law treats women when it comes to freedom of movement, to laws that prohibit discrimination and sexual harassment in the workplace, laws that affect women's pay and their rights to get married and have children, and also measure women's constraints to starting and running their own businesses, to different treatments of women when it comes to managing and inheriting assets and property, all the way to when women leave the workforce and retire. So we analyze also how laws impact the size of a woman's pension. And our data identified where discriminatory laws persist in these 8 areas that I just mentioned, and you can see also in the slide. So we have 8 we call indicators. And we measure how these laws affect different stages of a woman's professional lives, and also highlights opportunity for reform. And the Women, Business and the Law research builds on evidence of the critical link between gender equality and economic growth. And equality of opportunity is not only important because women are human beings and these are human rights, but also because there are economic benefits to equality. And we observe that gender equality is associated with narrowing the gender gap in development outcomes, higher female labor force participation, lower vulnerable employment, and greater representation of women in national parliaments. And though we've learned a lot about the benefits of gender equality over the last several decades, and here I would like to highlight, since 1970, over 1,500 legal reforms have been enacted by all economies around the world to close the legal gender gap. But we still see with women business and the law that women have only 75% of the legal rights afforded to men. And when we calculate the average of all the economies over all the indicators that we measure, we see that the global average score is just 76.1. And performance in the WBL index varies by region. So you see OECD high income economies score the highest, followed by Europe and Central Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, East Asia and the Pacific, Middle East and North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa that have the largest variation in scores, more than 60 points different between the best and the worst scoring economies. So every region has example of economies whose governments are implementing good practice legislation, and those that are still have room to improve. So countries can look to their neighbors within the region, within their peer in terms of income level, for examples when looking to implement reforms or inspire others to do so. In the 2021 edition, the one that we just published, our report finds that only 10 countries score 100, meaning that men and women are on equal legal standing across all the areas that we measure in only 10 of 190 countries. Recently, we saw Ireland passing a reform on parental leave, that means shared between mothers and fathers, and Portugal equalized the remarriage process for men and women. And those two countries join the previous 8 countries. So we have now a group of 10, including Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Latvia, Luxembourg, and Sweden. So only these 10 countries score 100, which means that a whopping 95% of the countries that we measure still have gaps between men and women in their laws. So going into a little bit about the specific case of Japan, the average global score for Japan is 81.9 out of 100. And we also see that same score in 2 other countries. So Colombia in Latin America and also Vietnam in East Asia and Pacific also score 81.9. And the overall score for Japan is higher than the WBL index global average of 76.1, but lower than the high income OECD economies average, which is 95.1. So when it comes to constraints on freedom of movement, laws affecting women's work after having children and during pregnancy, gender differences in property and inheritance, and laws that affect the size of a woman's pension, that is the indicators mobility, parenthood, assets, and pension, Japan gets a perfect score of 100. However, when it comes to laws that affect women's decision to work, laws that affect women's pay, constraints related to marriage, and constraints to women starting and running their own businesses, Japan could consider reforms to improve legal equality for women. And here you can see in this graph how the country compares with other countries within the OECD high income group, as well as the world. And this is a visualization that we have on our website, and I'll give you more details about it, but it's wbl.worldbank.org. We do have those visualizations there. They're very interesting. But now we can dive into each of these indicators to understand what each measures and which gaps still persist. And I'll pass it on to Julia now.
Thank you, Natalia.
So yeah, let's talk about the different indicators, the 8 indicators that we measure. And as mentioned, we have designed them to accompany a woman throughout her working life and show the different decisions that she takes, and that where the law maybe treats her differently than a man. And I'll also explain a few examples of Japan, of course. So starting with mobility, this indicator measures restrictions on women's freedom of movement. For example, if a woman can travel outside the country in the same way as a man. And the good news is, of course, that Japan scores 100, so has the full score. But it's still important to consider, of course, in your work also with other countries that removing restrictions on women's mobility is important so they can join the labor force and open their own businesses. Something we often highlight is the fact that in 35 countries around the world, women cannot choose where to live in the same way as men. Moving on to the workplace indicator, Japan only scores 50, so that's half of what we measure in this indicator that looks at laws that affect women's decisions to work, and that includes provisions that protect women against sexual harassment in employment. And it's maybe noteworthy that Japan is the only economy among all high-income OECD economies that still does not have legislation on sexual harassment in employment. There are guidelines, but there is no binding law. And so there is no law that has criminal penalties or civil remedies for sexual harassment in employment, which is what we would measure as a good practice. Globally, again, we measure 190 economies, and 49 of those lack protection against sexual harassment in employment. The last high-income OECD economy to pass a reform to ensure protection against sexual harassment was the United Kingdom in 2011. And we keep seeing a reform trend in this area over the past year, a reform that we're highlighting in our current 2021 report. Over the last year, Sierra Leone reformed their law in this regard and introduced protection from sexual harassment. The question is, why do we measure areas like domestic violence and sexual harassment? It's because it has enormous economic consequences. Sexual harassment in the workplace has economic impacts on the victims, but also on the economy itself. From victims, we know that harassment can result in depression, in absenteeism from work. Often even women are feel forced to leave their jobs. And so over the long run, this puts a burden on the entire economy, lost productivity, of course, and also increased costs for healthcare, for complaints, for investigations. What is sexual harassment? It may take many forms. It's insults and degrading attitudes of coworkers, of peers, of supervisors, demeaning jokes, but also unwelcome touching and full-on sexual assault. So it's important that the definition of sexual harassment in the law includes all these different behaviors. And of course, men and women experience sexual harassment in the workplace, but the rates are much higher among women. Moving on to the pay indicator, this indicator measures laws and regulations affecting women's pay. So this is basically the legal argument, the legal reasons why there is a gender wage gap. Japan scores 50, so again, we see room for improvement there. So I'll explain a little bit more about the indicator in the areas that we measure. There are 2 points. One is equal pay and one is job restrictions. A reform that we have in the equal pay indicator is the Marshall Islands that enacted a gender equality law, and also a provision that men and women now receive equal pay for work of equal value. In that area, noteworthy that Japan is among the 100 countries where there is no legal protection guaranteeing that women receive equal pay as men for equally valued jobs. And again, reforms are happening also, for example, in New Zealand and the United Arab Emirates. So let's look more at deeper at what the law should provide. I'm going to give a couple of examples from other high-income OECD economies. what does the question measure? It's whether the national law complies with the ILO Convention on Equal Remuneration. So again, we often rely on other international agreements when measuring good legal practices. And here the example of Denmark, wage discrimination may not take place in violation of this act. This includes direct and indirect discrimination. Every employer shall grant equal pay to men and women for the same work or for work to which equal value is attached. So here we're seeing the two principles, equal remuneration and work of equal value. If you look at the Japanese legislation, the Labor Standards Act provides that an employer shall not engage in discriminatory treatment of a woman as compared to a man with respect to wages. So the concept of wage is too narrow because it does not encompass all the components of remuneration, for example, benefits. So if we limit the definition to wages, we forego other areas where there could be a discriminatory pay. And the second point would be the concept of work of equal value. It means that workers are paid equally, not just those that do the exact same job, but also jobs that require maybe the same education, the same effort. An example that we sometimes give is if you look at a big building management, janitors to take care of the building are typically it's male associated job, and cleaning personnel is female associated. And so these are work of equal value, and these jobs should be paid equally. And moving on to another interesting finding still in the pay indicator, what we find is that globally, women in 88 countries cannot work the same jobs as men. These are different industries that we look at, from transport and manufacturing, construction, water, energy, or mining. Why do we look at these industries? Because often the work is highly remunerated. So again, if women are excluded from working underground or in mining, that cuts off an entire industry of highly remunerated job for women. And so that is what in Japan we still see in the labor standard acts, that women cannot work underground. And now we accompany our standard woman throughout her working life. And if she gets married, family law regulates the rights within marriage and also the ability to get a divorce and eventually to remarry. So under the marriage indicator, we see small room for improvement for Japan still, as women do not have the same rights to remarry as men. In the civil code, there is a waiting period of 6 months after a divorce or marriage annulment is finalized before a woman can get remarried. And this waiting period is something we still see in several countries around the world, in 66 countries to be exact. But only very few OECD high-income countries impose them. We actually have seen just over the last year lots of reforms in, if you want to look at the next slide, in Chile, Rwanda, Puerto Rico, and Portugal. All these countries removed the waiting period, which is often an archaic condition. It's because women's, it should be established that a woman isn't pregnant when she enters a new marriage. But of course, with new technology nowadays, we don't have to force a woman to wait 100 days or 300 days, as it is the case in several economies. And so Portugal removed this requirement, is now in the group of 10 economies that obtained a full score on our index. And then after marriage often comes parenthood. So this is an indicator where we measure the ability of new parents to take time off after the birth of a child. It also measures whether women are protected against dismissal during pregnancy. Because in 38 economies around the world, a woman can be fired just because she's pregnant. But good news again in Japan here that we, the country receives the full score. And what also is important under this indicator is the recognition that gender equality in the home is needed to achieve gender equality in the workplace. And here we're looking at this concept of redistribution of care responsibilities for children. So introduction of paternity leave, also increasing paternity leave for fathers, because even though many countries establish and guarantee paternity leave, the median duration is 1 week for fathers around the world, while for mothers, it's 14 weeks. So we, of course, see this unequal distribution of care work among parents. The next indicator is called entrepreneurship, where we look at women's ability to start a business and run a business. Small area for improvement also for Japan here. It's among 5 OECD high-income countries that do not have a law that prohibits gender-based discrimination and access to credit. Equal access to credit is, of course, very essential for women to open a business. What we know from other studies, from the IFC, for example, that there is a gender credit gap of $1.7 trillion US. And we know that women often face barriers when accessing credit because they have less collateral to pledge compared to men, less female land ownership, just less access to property. And also often we encounter bias and discrimination against women by lenders. So having a law that prohibits such discrimination can be a really valuable tool to bridge the gender credit gap. And of course, during the current crisis, there's a lot of talking about women entrepreneurship. How can we encourage females to open a business in order to build back better from the COVID-19 crisis? So having strong legal frameworks against discrimination is recommended. And we're seeing many reforms in that area. For example, Uzbekistan, Georgia would be good examples how to introduce such laws. Also, I have posted 2 examples from Canada and Iceland. In Canada, it's the Human Rights Act that prohibits discrimination based on sex, marital and family status when providing goods or services. And another example is Iceland. And by the way, when Iceland introduced this Equality Act in 2017, that's what put Iceland in the list of now 10 economies that received a full score. And so again, this access to goods and services, including financial services, there should not be any gender discrimination allowed. Then our 7th indicator is called assets. Here we're looking at property, access to property for men and women, particularly inheritance rights, whether sons and daughters can inherit equally from their parents, because again, this is what sets women off well into life if there's an equal standing with, sons and daughters are an equal standing, because having more inheritance means having more collateral, again, that can be, for example, pledged to obtain loans. And it's also the question of non-monetary contributions to the household, such as unpaid care for children. If women take a step back from work because they're taking care of children, and should the partnership end in divorce, is this recognized as value, as monetary value? And we've arrived at our last indicator, pension, at the end of a woman's life. Where are the gender differences in the law? One of our findings is that globally, in 66 out of the 190 economies, the ages for women to retire are earlier compared to men. Historically, it's this idea also that women would leave the labor market to take care of their families. And of course, that sounds great at first to retire early, but it also means for women that they have shorter working lives, so they have reduced contribution records and fewer opportunities to save money that would support them during their old age. And with this, I would give it back to Natalia.
Thank you so much, Julia. Can you hear me? Okay. So thank you so much, Julia. And just tying everything that Julia said, recently our team undertook a very big effort to research and calculate how our index looked like all the way back to 1970. And we did that for all 190 economies that's covered by women, business, and the law. And here in this graph, we can see the progress made by Japan over the past 50 years. And the country has come a long way. And you can see in the chart where you have spikes in the score, all the 6 reforms that were enacted throughout the years. And that put Japan, that had a, back in 1971, had a score of 65.6. And now recently, as we mentioned, in 2021, led to a score of 81.9. So you see in 1974, Japan prohibited gender discrimination in employment in general. In 1986, you see that Japan increased the duration of paid maternity leave to at least 14 weeks for mothers. Going to the 90s, in 1992, under the pension indicator, Japan explicitly accounted for periods of absence from work due to childcare in the calculation of pension benefits. That means when women do take that time off work to care for their children and for their newborns, that period taken off work is accounted for in the calculation of their pensions when it's time to retire. And then later on, in 1996, there was the introduction of paid paternity leave to fathers. And 2002, legislation that protects women from domestic violence. And more recently, the latest reform in 2011 was the introduction of paid parental leave, the one that's shared between mothers and fathers. But as we've highlighted throughout the presentation, and Julia very well pointed out, there's still work to be done, not only in Japan, but all over the world, just to ensure that women have the same opportunities as men, both at home, at work, and as entrepreneurs. And you see here a global perspective of our index over the past 50 years. So although gaps still persist, if we look back 50 years ago, we see that over time, each of the region and each of the country has made progress towards gender equality, although regions have improved in different paces and progress has been uneven. But it's good news to see that we are moving in the right direction. But if the pace of change stays the same as the one that we observed in the past 50 years, we will need at least another 50 years to achieve legal gender parity globally. And based on the annual increases in the average of women business and the law index, as I showed in the slides of the regional progress, we'll see that OECD high income economies will be the first to reach an average score of 100 by 2025. So in a few years, hopefully, we'll see all OECD economies reaching 100. But then we'll see the other regions picking up the pace. So for example, Latin America and the Caribbean, we'll see that if the pace remains the same, it would reach all economies in that region, would reach gender parity by 2043, still 20 years from now, 20 some years from now, and Europe and Central Asia in 2045. And then you think about other regions that are still ways away from reaching gender equality, such as the Middle East and North Africa. But if the last year has taught us anything, is that we can't wait that long. We can't wait another 50 years to reach equality in the law for men and women. And the need for reform now is even more urgent because the COVID-19 pandemic has widened longstanding gender inequalities around the world that even before the pandemic hit, those were already around. So data reveals already that has been a large drop in the proportion of female full-time employees relative to male full-time employees. And also the gender pay gap has also widened, and women are more likely now than men to take leave from work or even resign from their positions to care for their children due to the pandemic. And in our latest edition, the 2021 edition of the Women, Business and the Law report, we included data on measures that were put in place by governments to address some of the impacts of the pandemic on working women, and especially in 3 areas. So in the areas of childcare, responding to the childcare crisis, access to the court system, and particularly to family courts, and protecting women from violence and ensuring their access to health services. And the COVID-19 data collected by Women, Business, and the Law was incorporated in the UNDP Global Gender Response Tracker. And they had published that a while ago, but they just published a new version of it. And that sheds light on policy measures that were enacted by governments worldwide to tackle the COVID-19 crisis. So taking a closer look on the findings of that particular data on COVID-19 measures, we saw that several countries, including Japan, took steps to provide access to justice in several ways, including declaring family cases urgent during lockdown, allowing remote court proceedings for family matters, for example. And we also noticed that several countries already had those measures in place even before the pandemic, but then the pandemic showed the need to have such ways of accessing courts in times of crisis. It enhanced the need to have that in place. Also, moving to the childcare, nearly 40 countries around the world, also including Japan, introduced leave or benefit policies to help parents with childcare. And even so, these measures are likely insufficient to address the challenges that many working mothers already face, or the childcare crisis itself. And lastly, ensuring equal access to healthcare proved indispensable during the health crisis that we are now going through. And 44 countries now prohibit gender-based discrimination in access to healthcare, particularly when calculating health insurance premiums. And I would encourage you to access our website at wbl.worldbank.org, download the COVID-19 data set that's available on our website, so you can get the full picture of the measures that were introduced worldwide and get a deep dive on the information that we collected over the past year. And that brings me to the bottom line of the need to understand all these measures that were put in place. The legal environment that encourages and incentivizes women's work and foster their ability to care for their children, access justice, seek protection from violence, and ensure their access to healthcare makes them less vulnerable. And not only in the face of crisis, it's not only in extraordinary circumstances, but throughout their lives and their careers. And achieving gender equality requires a concerted effort by governments, civil society, and international organizations, among others. But legal and regulatory reforms can serve as an important catalyst to improve the lives of women as well as their families and communities. And amidst this pandemic that continues to threaten the progress that we've made so far, reforms that ensure equality of opportunity are more important than ever. So here, in addition to the findings that we showcase today in the WBL 2021 Index and the research on the gender effects of COVID-19, we've also included in this year's report important background research on childcare and access to justice. Those are two areas that we are planning to develop over the next few years. So you can learn more about these new areas and see the data, the full data set and data for every country, as well as past presentations and events we've made, deep dives on our methodology, data visualization tools, reforms database. We recently, to accompany the launch that we did in February 23rd, we revamped our website completely. So it's now very user-friendly. So we would love to invite you to explore the tools on the website. And of course, drop us a line, give us some feedback. If there's any country-specific analysis or regional analysis that you need, we are, of course, available to answer any questions you have. And I'll leave you here both our emails in case we don't answer your questions today during the Q&A session. But I would like to thank everyone, and thanks to the Tokyo office for having us over, and we look forward to hearing your questions and continuing the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Natalia and Julia, for your keynote presentation. We received several questions in advance, and also questions keeping coming in during your presentation. So let me read the first question, which was submitted in advance. How does the World Bank use the result of Women Business and the Law report to navigate policy discussion with the government of developing countries? Does the World Bank organize global or regional conferences or workshops to educate government leaders or officials? Does the World Bank collaborate with other international organizations such as UN organizations and other regional development banks to collectively help the government of developing countries in this regard? So would you please be able to comment on this, Natalia, Julia, please?
Sure, thank you, Kochi. I'll be happy to give a little bit of background on the next steps after we publish the data, what happens next. So yes, we do partner with several organizations on the ground in countries. So we do have what we call CSO engagement. So the goal is to build capacity on the ground, explore the data set, showcase ways in which the advocacy on the ground can be carried out. Due to the pandemic, of course, we weren't able to be in person doing these types of engagements, but we have been very active partnering. As I mentioned during the presentation, we partnered with the UNDP to include our data in the Global Gender Response Tracker. So that's a great tool to inform policymaking, especially regarding the COVID-19 data. But the data that we produce really bolster the World Bank data-driven approach to reforms. And it is a great help to policymakers that want to understand the economic impact that legal gender restrictions have on women within their countries, and also the impact on their economies and their growth. And over the years, as I mentioned, we've been doing this for 11 years. So over the years, the data set and the report have evolved into an actionable tool for task team leaders to reference when incorporating gender reforms into technical assistance, DPOs, or any types of instruments within the bank, and working closely with policymakers that want to do the right thing, but maybe they don't know where to start. I can give you a couple of examples that we've observed recently of our data being operationalized, because I think that adds a lot of value to the question as well. And we've seen that take place. It takes many different shapes according to the type of work being developed. So we saw recently in Azerbaijan, our data was crucial to inform legal restrictions to women's jobs. So the World Bank team was developing a transportation project and was looking into women's labor force participation in Azerbaijan. And once they looked into our data, particularly regarding the jobs that women couldn't do within the country, they realized that it was a running long list of over 600 jobs that women couldn't do in Azerbaijan. And that triggered a revision of such restrictions and they even brought in experts to see job by job, if the restrictions even made sense, which eventually they realized they don't. So we're now looking forward to see how the reforms are going to take place in Azerbaijan. We also have a couple examples in Vietnam, which enacted its new labor code recently, throughout the same project, using the WBL data as a starting point. The team developed some research that showed that laws in Vietnam restricted women from many occupations. And so the bank partnered with the government to reassess those restrictions and promote long-lasting changes to their new to their legislation. So they have a new labor code that came out. And so, yeah, these are just a couple examples that I have of how we put forth the reform agenda through both World Bank projects, but also capacity building of grassroots organizations, civil society organizations on the ground.
Thank you. That was a question from Sasaki-san. Next, two questions from the Mori-san. Let me read. On slide number 23, among different regions, Middle East and North Africa seems accelerating the pace of the improvement in the last several years. What is driving this trend, and what do you foresee this trend to continue in the future? And then the same person continued asking, would you please comment on the fragile, conflict, and violent countries in the report? In some cases, government may not be fully functional in effective manner in FCB countries. What would the World Bank be doing in supporting legal and other reforms for women in those countries? So Middle East and North Africa and FCB questions. Please, Natalia, Julia, thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll start with the first question, because that's really fascinating always for us to see how do these reforms happen, right? Because we have all these data points. Kind of the obvious answer is that if you have more data points on which you can improve, then obviously it's easier to boost the reform efforts, because there's so many places where you can start. And basically, yeah, if there's more room for improvement, then just any action will already get you, a higher score. Why in Sub-Saharan Africa and MENA? Because if you look at that historical data set that we have over the past 50 years, again, Middle East, North Africa started on a much lower score than other countries. And then there is kind of this domino effect sometimes that you can observe. If like a neighboring country it adopts a new law, that can kind of signal to other countries that, reform is doable, it's possible. Even, very sticky, difficult laws like family laws, that's an area where reform happens incredibly slowly. But we have seen changes in personal status laws in the United Arab Emirates, in Saudi Arabia. And there's kind of this signaling effect to the region that it is possible to, increase women's rights in the law. So, of course, then sometimes it gets more difficult if you have done, all the reforms that were kind of easy to pass in parliament, where there was a broad consensus in society to do these reforms. Others may be more sticky, but so that's what we're observing right now. And I think just similar message to FCV countries, just because it's a fragile country or there's conflict doesn't mean that we shouldn't involve women in the process. Like, it's the opposite. Actually, the message should be, and there is research that shows that if you involve women in peace negotiations, the agreements are more likely to last. So we actually want to bring women in, especially in these countries. Of course, it may be more difficult to pass laws because security concerns, unstable governments, but the World Bank must engage with these countries, and they do. An example from our work is until 2019, I believe we were covering 189 economies, and then we added Sudan. So we were able to collect data and introduce also Sudan to our data set of economies that we measure now.
Thank you very much for your responses. We received a set of questions actually related to Japan elements in analysis. So let me read them as a group. The first one: how do you see the gender representation on corporate boards of directors and gender pay gap in Japan? So that's one question. And the second question is: how do you think about women's entrepreneurship in Japan? What can you say about this point through the recent report? Why do you think Japan is still behind in promoting, especially in this regard? And then what do you recommend that Japan should do? And then another question related to Japan coming in during the presentation. I'm wondering Japan's equal remuneration for work of equal value is shifting to put them slightly different work and status to different value. Could you can you say the disparity from the gender gap score is regarding with the index of leaders position? So that's the question, the comment that just came in during the presentation. So I would like to ask both of you to comprehensively comment on those questions related to Japan element in the report. Thank you.
Yeah, gladly. So starting with the idea of entrepreneurship, female representation. So let's start with the corporate boards. That's an excellent question because we around the world see that there's just fewer women in leadership positions. On the very broad scale, what you can use is one of our correlations that came out in this report that countries with more gender equal laws, so countries that fare better on the WBL index, actually have more women in parliament. And this effect, the leadership effect has been shown time and again, like through mentoring and just through seeing women in leadership positions, that increases the aspirations of young women and brings more women into these positions. So how can you raise representation? One way to do it is through quotas. Several, especially OECD high-income countries, have introduced quotas. Norway was the first one, very famous example. In 2003, they said 40% of corporate boards should be female. Of course, that's not possible in every economy, but it has been successful in the Norwegian case. And if you look at studies, much talk about how gender diverse company boards fare better and more creativity, better output. So lots of discussions there. Then, in terms of entrepreneurship and the pay gap, I think the two big issues that we highlighted during the presentation is, of course, sexual harassment that sets women back. So having a strong protective framework, how this can be reported, kind of taken away the shame from sexual harassment. I think that's something with the Me Too movement, we've seen that around the world really take shape. So it's good to have both. You want to have the strong legal framework and you want to have an active discussion so that people actually come forward and feel comfortable talking about these topics. And the next point, again, in the general female labor force participation area and entrepreneurship area is parental leave policies. Because again, what sets women back is this kind of little gap when women are of childbearing age, that either they're not being hired because employers already are scared, they'll just leave to take care of their children. So if we redistribute this care responsibility better between women and men, so that it just becomes natural that men also take time off work for childcare, then that we have a whole new discussion. And there are some good legal tools to do that. When you look at paternity leave or parental leave policies, several countries like Germany, for example, have introduced certain quotas that you get just higher pay or more leave overall if it's not only the mother who takes time off, but also the father. So there are some good incentives in the law. And yeah, the equal remuneration question, very similar, changing kind of the norms in society and in the law.
Okay, thank you very much for your responses. Let me continue. Those are the questions from Tor-san and then also the anonymous participant raising the question. Thank you very much for your question. Okay, let me continue another question from Miyazaki-san, who is actually my boss. While agreeing to the importance of having equal legal provisions, how do you assess the enforcement of such laws? Isn't it possible for a country to have a perfect law but poor protection in reality? Or the laws of court precedents which may work as unwritten laws? So that's the one question from the Miyazaki-san. Thank you very much for your questions. I would like to ask you to comment on those points.
Yes, of course. I'll be happy to. We do get that question often because our report historically has tracked the legal differences in the law, the differences between men and women in the law. So we cover what we call the jury aspect of inequalities. And in several cases, we see that it's a comment that we get very often, that either the law exists, but it's not being implemented, or there is a restriction, but that doesn't happen in place. So we are still not, our project is not yet at a stage to have a prepared answer and assess the full implementation of laws, but we understand the importance of seeing what happens, what's written in the law, and versus what happens in reality. And that is part of the new areas of research that we are now developing. And hopefully in the next couple of years, we're going to have a more systematic way of analyzing the implementation and the impact and the effectiveness of these laws in practice. But it is true that it's not only, the law is, having the law in place is just the first step towards reaching gender equality. And it's also a good conversation starter, I think, also because the more we do the kind of conversations that we're having here today and all the events that we engage on, the civil society capacity building workshops we do, the more we talk about it, the more we understand the need to effectively implement these policies, the more we understand the economic impact of gender equality. So it moves beyond the legal provisions to actual reality. So it is extremely important, and I hope I can give a more concrete answer based on our research and our findings in another opportunity after we do develop that methodology for the implementation of the laws.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely, yeah. Just to add on everything Natalia said, but it's really not just because a law is there. Sorry, what I mean is, like, you have to draft good laws, right? And we look at that in our index. It's not just like a law on the book. Like, in our methodology, we also look if there are some certain enforcement mechanisms. So, for example, talking about non-discrimination laws, if a country just has, a policy in place, we wouldn't necessarily see that as a good practice. There should be some enforcement mechanisms, like an internal complaint procedure, like penalties, like sanctions that happen in case of discrimination. And the same for sexual harassment. We're looking at civil or criminal remedies. So there are some enforcement mechanisms already in our index.
Thanks for the compliment, Julia. That's very well said.
Great, thank you very much. Let me continue with more questions. Question from Professor Yoshino. Thank you very much for your question. Is there any comparison in budget spending related to gender equality? Which countries is the highest and lowest? And female entrepreneurs tend to return their money much more diligently than men, which is observed in Asia. Does similar phenomena can be seen in Africa and Latin America? So those are the questions from Professor Yoshino. Thank you very much. And let me read one question posted on the YouTube. How do you put the migrants or non-nationals, as they have sometimes different position in law? So those are the questions I would like to ask now, Julia and Natalia to comment. Thank you.
Great. Let me start right with the budgetary commitments. That's an excellent point, and something that we're looking at in this area of measuring implementation that Natalia was mentioning. So right now we don't measure anything like that, but that would be an idea. Obviously, how do you give teeth to a law? By having, police, by having services for victims of domestic violence, by having maybe more judges or specialized courts. So all these areas of accessing justice, that would be an idea to look at budgetary commitments. We're not doing that yet. But great idea. And when it comes to, we're back on entrepreneurship, female entrepreneurs, and we hear this notion a lot that, female entrepreneurs are very diligent, their repayment histories are excellent. yeah, and if you work in the World Bank, you see this really a lot, why there is such a big drive to support women entrepreneurs. And then there's this huge discrepancy, right? We know that women, they often borrow from microfinance institutions, or they just form savings cooperatives because it is so difficult for them to access the formal system. So there's this gap that we need to find ways to bridge. One thing is, and we have done this work with our colleagues in doing business, to look at repayment histories and from microfinance institutions, for example, whether or not that is reported to a formal credit reporting system. So that was an idea to include female borrowing history. And yeah, just other ways of accepting collateral, moving away from just immovable collateral, like such as land, but just accepting movable collateral, anything for getting loans. So yeah, because you asked about the regional differentiation, and I believe that is actually a worldwide phenomenon. But yeah, it's really all about bridging the credit gap. And the last question on migrants, unfortunately, we do not have much information on that, because as we cover such a wide set of countries, 190 economies, we need to rely on some standard assumption to make the data comparable. So our standard assumption is that the woman in question that goes through these different steps of economic decisions, that she's a national of the country in which she lives. But of course, there's other projects in the bank that look at migrant women.
Thank you very much. Let me read the two more questions and ask you, both of you, to respond together with your final remarks. Then we wrap up a seminar. The first one, Ida-san from JICA posted on your question on the YouTube. Thank you very much for your question. Any concrete data on legal barriers and economic outcomes? Would you find any relations between the social value system and legal barriers? So that's the questions from Ida-san from JICA. Thank you very much. The other question from Paria from the Meiji University. Thank you very much for your question. In many countries, maybe in the name of law, rights are given to every woman in order to equalize with men. However, in reality, it is not implemented, especially in South Asia countries. So how this can be corrected and monitored by the World Bank Group to see whether in reality it is really implemented. I think the introduction to the law is not not sufficient. So the question related to South Asia situations. So with that, I would like to ask Julia and Natalia to respond together with your final comment and messages to the viewers, and then we wrap up the seminar. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take it first. So yeah, again, an invitation to look at our data on these correlations between the law and economic outcomes. Countries that fare better on our index, that have more gender equal laws, have better development outcomes, higher female labor force participation, and lower gender wage gap. So we just keep saying this argument. It's true that often the law is not implemented, but the data does show us that it does matter. So the law does matter. And yeah, let's bring more women into decision-making positions. Let's make sure that we just keep this conversation going. We cannot recover from the COVID-19 pandemic without women in decision-making positions, without having female entrepreneurs really take it up.
Yeah, just adding to what Julia was saying, and also answering the second question on the law is not enough, implementation is essential. Just going back to what we said, yes, we are aware that the law itself is not enough, but having good drafted laws, as Julia mentioned, based on internationally recognized good practices, looking at the improvement not only in the index score, but in the economic growth and social welfare in other economies, serves as a good benchmark for a country to continue having this social norms change. Like those things go hand in hand, both the social change and also drafting of good laws. So I would end on that note. We need to continue having these conversations, as Julia said, advocating for better drafted laws and raising awareness of the need of involving women to build back better. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much. With us this morning from Washington, Julia Brown-Miller, Private Sector Development Specialist in the World Bank's Women, Business and Law Project, and Natalia Mazzoni, the Analysis in the same Women, Business and Law Project of the World Bank. Thank you very much for both of you being with us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Franz.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you. Thank
you very much. So we continue organizing morning seminars. Please check our website for the details of upcoming online seminars. Future topics will be refugee education, commodity market outlook, and regional economic updates. So stay safe, stay healthy. See you next time. Thank you very much.